You're probably clicking on this video because you're interested in either macro photography or infrared photography, or perhaps both. In this video, we're going to be exploring a little bit about infrared photography and whether or not it's useful and interesting when combined with macro photography. There's a lot to cover, so stick around and I'll get started in just a sec. Hi guys, I'm Ben from Adaptalux and welcome back to another photography tutorial. We've been playing around with infrared photography. It's something that we get asked quite often about when we're making UV videos or of course showing off our UV lighting arms. It raises that question of what about the other end of the spectrum? Why aren't you making products for infrared photography? And we asked ourselves the same question. Why aren't we making products for infrared photography? Well, the answers are going to be in this video. We're going to cover what infrared photography is all about, whether or not it's worth combining it with macro, and whether or not you need some specific lighting products in order to do that. So let's answer that first question of what is infrared photography. I'd be very surprised if you've never seen any infrared photography before. Usually it's found in landscape photographers' portfolios because it really lends itself to landscape images. You have maybe seen some and assumed that it was some strange Photoshop effect because all of the colours in the image will be a little bit strange. Perhaps it's just a black and white image, but all of the brightnesses of the foliage are slightly off, or perhaps it's a little bit more obvious and that foliage is red or yellow or even purple and the sky is a strange colour, but everything else is completely colourless. That is infrared photography, and it's not a Photoshop effect. It does involve some Photoshop and some editing, but it's actually captured in the camera. That effect is created by a full spectrum camera and a series of filters that can filter out the visible light, the UV light, and leave you only with infrared light, which the camera can then capture and of course we can interpret. Now, I did mention that the camera has to be a full spectrum camera. That means that you'll have to convert your camera. Cameras generally only capture the visible spectrum, the light that we can actually see. However, if you send your camera away to be converted into a full spectrum camera, then your camera is going to be capable of seeing a lot more than the human eye. We sent our camera away to a company called LifePixel in the US. They specialize in converting cameras into infrared and full spectrum capabilities. So it's wise to choose a camera that you're not going to be using for your normal shootings, perhaps a little bit old. We have here a Sony A7 Mark I. So we sent this off to LifePixel and they took it apart and converted it to be a full spectrum camera. This camera can now capture ultraviolet, natural light, the visible light that we see all the time, and infrared. You then have to limit that range back down again to capture only what you want. So we don't want infrared and visible light and UV light, so we're going to cut out all of that UV and all of the visible light using a filter on the front. There's lots of different choices of filters. You can even narrow that range back down so that it's a normal camera again if you want to still use your camera. But what we have here is a super color infrared filter. That means that it's going to let a little bit of color through in very specific narrow ranges right near that infrared range, and that's going to create those weird colorful images where the foliage is a slightly different color. I don't know the full technical specifications of how this happens, so I will link down in the description to LifePixel. They have full blogs on how to send off your camera, what's going to happen, what are you going to need, how you take your infrared images, and how you then process them. All of that information is down in the description. For now, I want to talk a little bit about how you capture an infrared image and how that translates into macro photography. Taking a photo in infrared is relatively straightforward once you have your converted camera. It is worth noting that there is a difference in the type of camera that you get converted. A mirrorless camera can use any lens that you put on the front of it, whereas a DSLR, you will need to adapt the lens or use specific lenses to get the same effect. So we got a mirrorless camera converted, and we can now change our lenses to our heart's content, whether that's to zoom into a more distant object in a landscape or perhaps try out some macro infrared photography. We're wondering whether there's maybe a reason that most infrared photography is done on landscapes. Is infrared photography even viable in macro? Well, let's put a macro lens on our camera and find out. So I've grabbed some generic green foliage, which might seem a little bit boring compared to our normal macro subjects that we cover on the channel, but this is actually ideal for testing out infrared macro, because this is the type of stuff that glows and changes color in the landscape shots, and I want to see whether this has any effect in macro as well. I don't see why it should behave any differently, but I'm thinking it's perhaps the contrast between this foliage and the rest of the scene that actually gives the landscape images that interesting and otherworldly feel. I have changed my lens. This is now a Tokina 100mm f2.8 macro lens, so we're getting nice and close, but it does still have that same super color filter on the front. So that's giving us this result on the back of the camera, which looks completely red. And this is normal. This is how everything looks. Even if you're doing a landscape, everything is red. The camera simply doesn't know how to process infrared light. It's just going to show it as a red image, but the data is still there and we're going to recover it in post-processing. So what you're actually looking for on the back of the camera here is your focus, your composition, and any little bits of contrast within the red. Some parts of the red will look more red, some will look more white, and that is the subtle sign that something interesting is going to happen in your final image. So I hope you can see there that it's tricky to figure out what everything is going to look like when you're looking at the back of the camera. Everything is red, and it's really hard to tell whether something's going to look really cool after editing or whether it's just going to be fairly mundane. So let's jump onto the computer and see what these images are going to look like in comparison to a more traditional infrared landscape shot. Let me very briefly show you the difference between an unedited and a finished infrared image that's a landscape, and then we can take a look at the same process in macro. So straight out of the camera, you can see that everything is far too red, way too far red. And usually if you had something like this in your camera, you would try and compensate your white balance by lowering this temperature slider down. And as you can see, it doesn't quite do it. It's still very red. We're getting a little bit into the purples on the foliage, but it's not enough. That range of the temperature slider is not far enough to be able to get us back into a normal color temperature range. So what we actually need to do is set up a profile. I'll link down in the description on how to do this, but you can set up your own profile that allows you to double this effect. So basically this profile here is adding an extra color temperature slider, which is all the way to the left, and then we can then tweak this a little bit normally by sliding this color temperature slider. So as you can see, we can move this back and forth now, and we're starting to get back into a more recognizable color temperature range, even though everything still looks a little bit strange. Now what I'm going to do is use the color picker here and select a reasonable area that I think should be white. So I think this gravel over here should be looking quite white, and you can see there that it makes the sky orange and the trees blue. This is because this image is actually inverted. So what we need to do here is head over to Photoshop and invert that image again. So as you can see, we've got our image in Photoshop now, and to finish this off, we need to add an adjustment layer to invert this image. There's a couple of different methods to do this, and they do provide different results. The first one is by using the invert adjustment layer here, so I can add that invert adjustment layer, and then I'm going to set the blend mode to color. And there you go, we have that red foliage. You can see the sky reflected in the water down here, and it's looking blue. You can make all sorts of adjustments to this going forward, but that is one of the two options that we have for this super color infrared image. Now if I just hide that invert layer, I'll show you the other way to do this, and that's by using the channel mixer, and we're essentially going to swap the red and the blue channels over. So on the blue output channel, I'm going to set the blue to 0 and the red to 100, and then I'm going to the red output channel, setting the red to 0 and the blue to 100. And as you can see, we've now inverted the image again, but with slightly different results. The trees are yellowish, and the sky and water are slightly more azul coloured rather than a deeper blue. So it really is a choice as to whether you like the yellow or red foliage. You can of course tweak these colours even further by changing the colour temperature in your original raw file. So if I open that back up and choose a slightly different colour temperature spot, so let's go for the sky and pass that back through to Photoshop, this is going to change to reflect that new color temperature selection. So as you can see, the cliffs are a little bit more yellow than they should be, which is why I chose the cliffs as the white point in my image. So if I just go and change that back, we can then start to look at some of the results from our macro shots. I've actually set up some actions to do all of this for every single one of my images. So I can just select my little IR just here and press play, and it will add both of these channels so that I can switch between them at will. So if I hit invert and color swap and play on that, then you can see that I've got my channels and my invert adjustment layers, and I can switch between them to see which style I like the best. Now I'm going to use this same recorded action on my macro shots to see what they look like in infrared. So as you can see, here's my my quick photo of a leaf. It's not the best photo in the world, but it does get us nice and close to the leaf, and you can see some of the detail in red here. I've chosen my infrared profile, and now I need to choose a white point, and this is where things start to get tricky. Because I don't have any reference of what should be white here, I'm going to choose the table. So this is the background, the table down here, that should be white, and that of course makes my leaf completely blue. Now if I open this up in Photoshop, you'll see that we've got our blue leaf here, and I can press play on my infrared action and swap those colors. It makes the leaf yellow instead of blue, or red instead of blue. I'm thinking that this doesn't really add to a conventional macro shot. This is simply changing the color of the leaf. There's no additional contrast or interesting features appearing within the leaf itself. Comparing that to our landscape shot, obviously the enjoyment and striking nature of this shot comes from that strange contrast between red foliage and colorless background and then a blue sky. It's playing tricks on our eyes because we're used to the sky being blue. That says that everything is normal, but then the red of the foliage is a little bit strange. So it's a bit of a trick. In our macro shot though, this could just be an autumn leaf or a yellow leaf. You don't get the same kind of effect that you would usually get from an IR photo. Now, that's not to say that I'm not missing something. This was taken right next to a window, so perhaps there's something that we can do by adding a little bit of light. I mentioned at the start of the video that we get asked a lot of questions about infrared photography and infrared lighting for macro photography. This is because we make a lighting system called the Adaptalux Studio. It's usually for conventional light, where you plug in a lighting arm and then you can bend that light around, and it's ideal for macro photography. We also make ultraviolet lighting arms that enable UV IVF photography. I'll link to a video up in the top right hand corner that explains that process, but it's a little bit different to infrared photography, but a similar sort of technical niche. Now, the questions are raised about infrared photography, and we've never really considered it, but we've been considering it. We've made some prototype infrared lighting arms. We wanted to see what all of the fuss was about, why are we getting these questions, and is there anything to it? So we're going to place some of these infrared lighting arms down on our leaf that we just took a look at and see whether it makes any difference to our end result. Of course, outside you have lots and lots of infrared light coming from the sun, so indoors you might need a little bit more. Let's see what happens if we place our infrared lighting arms down onto our subject. So the next question is, what happens to this image if we add some additional light? So I'm going to take 2 more test shots. This is just under the ambient light in my room. Perhaps there's not an awful lot of infrared in here. We are right next to a window, but I am going to add some more normal white light using the Adaptalux Studio, take a shot, and then try the same thing again using some infrared light. Let's get a lot of normal white light into this image. You can see that the red is slightly changing on our shot here. It looks now an awful lot more red. So let's take this shot and then change to our infrared lighting arms that we've made specially for this test. Having swapped from our conventional light to our infrared lights, you can see the difference here. Or rather, you can't see the difference because this camera that you're looking through obviously isn't infrared capable. Our eyes aren't infrared, so you can't see any light happening down here, but the infrared camera can. So if I take away these lights, you can see that change where the light is disappearing and coming back. This camera can see the invisible infrared light produced by these infrared lighting arms. Now, what remains to be seen is whether or not that makes a difference to our macro foliage image in infrared. So let me get onto the computer, process all of these images, and we can take a look at the comparison between no lighting, conventional white lighting, and infrared lighting. Let's take a look at my 3 test shots before I invert them. So this is with my infrared color profile and color temperature adjustments already made, and you can already see that there is a little bit of a difference here. We're getting less saturation the further we go from natural daylight. So this one was taken just with the daylight in my room and from the window. This one was taken using conventional light but artificial light from the Adaptalux Studio, and then this one was taken with pure infrared light. If we open these 3 up into Photoshop and apply the invert, you'll see the one that we had earlier on looking nice and yellow. Inverted, this one looks, well, slightly less yellow, and then this one looks, well, very, very dull indeed. There's no yellow here at all. And I think this is because the lens, the filter rather that we're using, the super color filter actually relies on a little bit of color coming through as well to give that effect. And the further we go from this daylight, the less color we're getting. I think that the infrared doesn't really add anything to the image itself. Perhaps it highlights these veins ever so slightly more than it would otherwise, but ultimately you're getting a very dull image when you're shooting in IR very close up here. The enjoyment of these changing colors is actually the contrast between the foliage, the colorless surrounding, and then the natural looking sky. It's a trick of the eye. Looking at the sky, you think, oh, this is a normal image, and then, well, the trees look a bit strange, and why is everything else colorless? That's where the enjoyment of this effect comes from. When you're super close up to something like this, you simply don't have that contrast between elements of the image. If you're shooting just a green leaf, it really doesn't add anything other than a color change, which effectively you could do in Photoshop anyway. Especially if you're then trying to add some artificial light, the color change becomes less pronounced, and adding only infrared light to the image only adds elements of black and white. Of course, infrared is colorless, so unless you're going to make some really drastic changes to this image, there really is very little to be added by having infrared light. So as you can see there, using a dedicated infrared light source on our macro subject to create infrared photography, it really doesn't make that much of a difference to the end result, which in my opinion is relatively disappointing anyway, especially compared to those landscape infrared shots. Does this mean that we're not making infrared lighting arms? Well, for the time being, yes. However, we're still a little bit confused as to why we've had so many questions about this. This was our test we were trying to figure out why everyone wants infrared lighting arms. So if you want infrared lighting arms for a specific reason, let us know down in the comments. Is there something that we're missing, not considering? Is there some method that we don't know about that would really benefit from having dedicated infrared macro light sources? We want to hear about it in the comments. We want you to prove us wrong so that we can make these infrared lighting arms and of course sell them to you so that you can then start using them for whatever purpose you might have. For the time being though, we're pretty convinced that this is a bit of a dead end. We're not interested in infrared macro photography. It simply is not the same as the infrared effects that you're going to get when you have the sky and lots of foliage and man-made objects. All of that contrast in a landscape photo is very difficult to get anything like that in macro. Let us know if we're wrong. Let us know if you enjoyed this video, if you learned something, by hitting the like button, and make sure to subscribe for lots more macro photography tutorials, ideas and inspiration coming in the future. For now, that is all I've got time for. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.